It was October 2016, and we were standing at the crumbling gates of the old amusement park in Chesterfield, New Jersey. The sign above was barely hanging on, rusted bolts creaking with every gust of wind. It read, Happy Trails Park, though the only thing happy about it now was the fact that it had survived another year of abandonment without collapsing entirely. I could feel the chill air biting at my skin, but that rush of excitement kept me warm. This was our kind of adventure, off-limits, eerie, and most importantly, ours to conquer. You sure about this, Ethan? Hannah's voice cut through my thoughts. She was standing just behind me, her eyes wide and wary, her gaze bouncing between the darkened rides that loomed over us. She gripped the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles were turning white. Come on, Hannah, I said, giving her my best grin. This is going to be awesome. We're making memories tonight. I looked over at Connor, who was already fiddling with his camera, capturing the overgrown rides and the shattered ticket booth. Connor was all about the footage. He loved turning our adventures into mini horror films, clips full of us sneaking through old forgotten places, making every shiver and gasp seem like we were starring in our own scary movie. Let's get some of this creepy vibe on tape, Connor said, pointing the camera at me and Hannah. Give me a line, Ethan. Tell the world how we ended up here, about to get killed by ghosts. He laughed, though the sound barely echoed in the emptiness. Well, it's a story of rebellion, I said, shrugging dramatically. A story of friendship, thrills, and incredibly poor judgment. I gave Hannah a playful nudge, and she shot me a glare that told me she still wasn't convinced this was a good idea. We walked deeper into the park, weaving through bumper cars covered in graffiti, dodging vines that seemed to stretch across our path like skeletal fingers. The place was huge, much bigger than I had imagined. As we made our way to the heart of the park, we stumbled across an old storage shed, its door hanging slightly ajar. Connor, of course, had to peek inside. Look at this, he said, pulling a faded clown costume from the darkness. The fabric was tattered, stained with what looked like rust, or maybe worse. He held it up, and the empty eyes of the mask seemed to stare back at us, hollow and unsettling. Nope, 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 nope. Hannah shook her head and took a step back. I could see the fear flickering in her eyes, and I knew why. She hated clowns. Ever since we were kids, she'd had this thing about them. And honestly, standing there in the dark with that old costume hanging in Connor's hands, I could kind of see why. It's just a costume, I said, though my voice sounded less convincing even to myself. Connor gave a wicked smile, slipping the mask over his face for a moment before Hannah slapped it out of his hands. Suddenly, a metallic clanking echoed across the park, the sound reverberating in the silence. We all froze. The noise was coming from the Ferris wheel, a rusted hulk that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Slowly, we turned our heads, and that's when we saw it, a figure in a filthy clown costume pedaling the old wheel into motion. Is this part of your plan, Connor? Hannah whispered, her voice shaky. Connor didn't answer. The camera was pointed at the figure, his hands trembling as he tried to keep it steady. That's not me, he stammered. The clown turned its head toward us. The painted smile on its face twisted and cracked. It stood up, leaving the Ferris wheel creaking as it spun lazily behind it. The clown took a step towards us, and then another. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. This was real. Too real. We weren't alone. Run! I breathed, grabbing Hannah's hand. We took off, sprinting through the overgrown paths, Connor right behind us. I could hear his breath, ragged and panicked. The clown's footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and unrelenting. He wasn't running, but he didn't need to. He was driving us further into the park, away from the way out, deeper into the maze of rusted rides and abandoned dreams. We darted into a maintenance area, hoping to find somewhere to hide. The walls were lined with old tools, hammers, wrenches, things that looked like they could be useful but were just out of reach. Connor was panting, his camera still rolling, capturing the chaos of the moment. What do we do? Hannah whispered, her eyes darting around the room. She was scared, more scared than I'd ever seen her, and it hit me then just how much trouble we were really in. The door slammed open, and there he was, the clown. His chest was heaving beneath the stained fabric, his eyes wild behind the mask. He raised a wrench, his voice finally breaking the silence. "Get out of my park!" he roared, his voice raw and full of rage. He swung the wrench, smashing Connor's camera to the ground, the pieces scattering across the floor. "This is my place. You kids think you can just come in here and take whatever you want, destroy whatever you want? This is mine." His voice cracked, and I could hear the desperation behind the anger. He wasn't just some psycho. He was a man trying to hold on to something that had slipped away a long time ago. "We're sorry," Hannah said, her voice barely a whisper, her hands up in surrender. "We'll leave, I swear." The clown took a step towards us, his wrench raised, and I thought that maybe this was it. Maybe we'd pushed too far, and this was where it ended. But then, a shout echoed from outside, followed by the flashing of blue and red lights. "Police! Drop the weapon!" The clown froze, his eyes flickering between us and the door. Slowly, he lowered the wrench, his shoulders slumping as he let it fall to the floor with a heavy clang. The police rushed in, pulling him away, his screams echoing through the empty park. He kept shouting about how this was his place, his home, and we had no right to be there. As they led him away, one of the officers turned to us, his face softening as he took in our terrified expressions. "You kids are lucky," he said. "He's been living here for months, defending this place like it's his own territory. Could have been a lot worse." We walked back to Connor's car in silence, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving only the cold October air and the realization of what we'd just been through. I glanced at Hannah, her face pale and her eyes wide. She caught my gaze and gave me a shaky smile. "No more abandoned places," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart still pounding. "No more clowns." We climbed into the car, and as Connor started the engine, I looked back at the Ferris wheel, still turning slowly in the wind. It wasn't about the thrill anymore. It wasn't about making memories. It was about understanding that some places, some things, were abandoned for a reason. Story 2. It was May 2018, and I was nearing the end of my shift at Denver Children's Hospital. The bright murals of cartoon animals on the walls did little to lift the heaviness I felt. The ICU was always a mix of hope and heartbreak, and today had leaned heavily toward the latter. I adjusted my scrubs and sighed, forcing a smile as I passed one of my patients, little Emma, who was sitting up in bed, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Her smile was weak but genuine, and it helped push away some of the day's gloom. "Nurse Karen, is Chuckles coming today?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. I nodded. "He sure is, sweetheart. He'll be making his rounds soon." Emma beamed, and I couldn't help but smile back, even though a shiver ran down my spine at the thought of Brian Chuckles Peters. Chuckles had become quite the sensation in the ICU. A volunteer clown, he had a knack for making the kids laugh, and for a while I had thought he was a blessing. He seemed to bring light into a place that desperately needed it. But lately, I'd noticed things that didn't sit right. Subtle changes in some of the children after his visits. A dip in their vitals, or a sudden bout of restlessness that hadn't been there before. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the stress of working in the ICU getting to me. But then supplies began to go missing. Minor things, easily overlooked, like syringes and sedatives. I mentioned it to Dr. Marcus Lee, the head physician, but he dismissed it. "Karen, you're overthinking this," he said with a weary smile. "The kids love him. He's harmless." But something in my gut told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with Brian Peters. That night, I decided to stay late. I told myself it was just to finish up some paperwork, but the truth was, I wanted to see what Chuckles was up to during his rounds. The ICU was quieter than usual. The only sound, the steady beeping of monitors and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I kept to the shadows, watching as Brian moved from room to room. his bright red nose and painted smile seeming almost grotesque in the dim light. I followed him, my heart pounding, as he entered the room of a boy named Lucas. Lucas had been stable for days, his condition finally improving. Brian closed the door behind him and I moved closer, peering through the small window. What I saw made my blood run cold. Brian was holding a syringe, his eyes focused and intent as he leaned over Lucas. The boy was asleep, unaware of the danger hovering over him. I didn't think, I just acted. I burst through the door, my voice shaking as I shouted, "What are you doing?" Brian turned to me, his painted smile twisted into something dark and menacing. "They don't have to suffer, Karen," he said, his voice low and almost gentle. "I'm giving them peace, a way out." My heart was in my throat as I lunged for the syringe, knocking it out of his hand. He grabbed my wrist, his grip like iron, and for a moment I thought he was going to hurt me. But then the door flew open and Dr. Lee was there, his eyes wide with shock. He grabbed Brian, pulling him away from me, and the syringe clattered to the floor. The police arrived soon after, their presence a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. They took Brian away, his painted face expressionless, his eyes vacant as they led him out of the hospital. I stood there, shaking, as Dr. Lee put a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Karen," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I should have listened. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage and questions. The story of the volunteer clown with a hidden agenda spread quickly. Reporters camped outside the hospital, their cameras ready to capture every tearful interview. The hospital tightened its screening process for volunteers. New protocols put in place to ensure something like this could never happen again. But the damage was done. The trust that had once filled the ICU had been shattered, replaced by a sense of unease that lingered long after the cameras were gone. I tried to focus on my patients, to be the nurse they needed. But every time I saw a volunteer in the hallway, I felt a pang of doubt. I visited Lucas the day after the incident. He was awake, his eyes wide and confused as he asked me why Chuckles wasn't coming to see him anymore. I forced a smile, my heart aching as I sat by his bed. "He had to go away, sweetheart," I said softly. "But don't worry, you're safe now." And that was what mattered, keeping them safe. Even if it meant questioning everything, even if it meant standing up when no one else would. I had trusted my instincts, and it had made all the difference. But as I walked through the ICU, the laughter of the children echoing around me, I couldn't help but wonder how close we had come to losing them, how fragile the line between light and darkness truly was. Story 3. It was June 2021, and the air was thick with humidity at the construction site in Akron, Ohio. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, and the only light came from the high beams we had set up to keep the site illuminated. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and glanced over at Tony, who was standing by the truck, his eyes darting nervously around the site. "You look like you've seen a ghost," I said, smirking. Tony was always superstitious, and the rumors about some clown roaming the site at night had really gotten under his skin. "Laugh all you want, Jake," Tony said, his voice a little shaky. "But I'm telling you, something's not right about this place. People have seen him. The construction site clown. I'm not making this up." I shook my head, rolling my eyes. "It's probably just some punk kids messing around. You know how it is. They hear we're working night shifts and they think it's funny to freak us out." Tony didn't look convinced. He just muttered something under his breath and went back to checking the inventory. I tried not to let his unease get to me, but there was something about the empty site at night that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The half-finished buildings cast long shadows, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The creak of scaffolding, the distant hum of machinery cooling down, the echo of our footsteps on the gravel. A few nights earlier, tools had started disappearing. Nothing major, just small things, a wrench here, a hammer there. It was annoying, but I still thought it was just kids sneaking onto the site after we left. But then Tony had seen him. The clown. He swore up and down that he'd seen someone in a clown suit lurking near the unfinished elevator shaft. I'd laughed it off, but now, as the night stretched on, I started to wonder if there was more to it. We took our break around midnight. Tony went to grab a coffee from the truck while I stayed behind, finishing up some measurements for the new beams. The site was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't really alone. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at me. "Tony?" I called out after a while, but there was no answer. I frowned, setting down my tools and walking towards the truck. "Tony, quit messing around. We've got work to do." Still nothing. My stomach tightened, a feeling of dread creeping in. I heard a noise then, a low, muffled sound coming from one of the newly constructed buildings. My heart pounded as I made my way over, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound led me to the elevator shaft. The hair on my arm stood on end as I looked down, and that's when I saw him. Tony, tied up, his eyes wide with fear, and standing over him, in the dim glow of my flashlight, was the clown. His face paint was smeared, his clothes dirty and torn, and there was something about the way he stood, the tension in his body, that told me he wasn't here for laughs. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty structure. The clown turned slowly, and I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the smeared makeup. A face I recognized. Evan Matson. He used to be the foreman here, before he got fired last year. I remembered the rumors, how he'd been unfairly blamed for a major delay, how he'd lost everything because of it. "You took it all from me," Evan said, his voice low and filled with venom. "The company, all of you. You ruined me, so I'm ruining you. I'm taking it all back." My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move, to do something. I wasn't going to let him hurt Tony, or anyone else. I lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. We struggled, his fists swinging wildly, but I managed to pin him down, shouting for Tony to get out of there. Tony, still bound but determined, managed to wriggle free enough to kick at the ropes holding his legs. I kept Evan down until I heard the distant wail of police sirens. Relief washed over me as the flashing lights filled the unfinished building, officers rushing in to pull Evan away, his screams echoing in the night. After it was over, Tony and I sat on the back of the truck, both of us bruised and exhausted. "You still think it was just kids messing around?" Tony asked, his voice shaky but with a hint of a smile. I shook my head, letting out a long breath. "Guess not," I said. "Sometimes the ghosts are real, huh?" The company faced a lot of heat after that. Questions about how they handled Evan's firing, why they hadn't done more to prevent something like this. They put new security measures in place, more guards, better lighting. But for Tony and me, the damage was done. The site never felt the same after that night. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound more sinister. I learned that even the toughest skeptic can be caught off guard, that sometimes the things you dismiss as stories or rumors have a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. And sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're just people, broken and angry, dressed in masks that only make their pain more terrifying. Story 4. It was September 2019 in Dallas, Texas, and the sun was shining brightly as I put the finishing touches on my son Tommy's birthday decorations. Balloons and streamers hung across the backyard, and the smell of hot dogs grilling on the barbecue filled the air. I wanted this day to be perfect for Tommy. He'd been so excited about his clown-themed birthday party, and I was determined not to let anything ruin it. "Mom, when's the clown getting here?" Tommy shouted, bouncing up and down with excitement. His friends were gathered around, their faces painted with smiles, eagerly waiting for the entertainment to begin. "Soon, sweetheart," I said, smiling at him. I glanced at my phone, checking the time. Kevin Bubbles Dawson, the clown I'd hired, was supposed to be here any minute. I'd found his ad online. He had good reviews, seemed professional enough. But as I heard the doorbell ring, I couldn't shake a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. Kevin arrived in full costume, his bright red wig slightly askew, and his painted smile wider than seemed necessary. The kids cheered, running to greet him as he pulled out his bag of tricks, producing balloon animals and juggling balls. For a while, everything seemed fine. The kids were laughing, and Kevin had them captivated with his antics. But then, something changed. Kevin's behavior became erratic. His jokes got darker, and he seemed to fixate on certain kids, staring at them a little too long. He insisted on taking the kids to the backyard for a special game, his voice too eager, his eyes too wild. I watched uneasily as he led them away, his hand resting on Tommy's shoulder. I followed them, my heart pounding. Something felt wrong. As I stepped into the backyard, I saw Kevin standing with the kids near the far fence, his back to me. He was talking to them in a low voice, his hands moving in strange gestures. The kids looked confused, some of them uncomfortable. "Hey, Kevin!" I called, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. "Why don't we bring the kids back to the party?" He turned to me, his painted smile seeming more like a grimace. "They're fine, Laura," he said, his tone suddenly defensive. "We're just having a little fun." Before I could respond, I heard a voice behind me. "Everything all right here, ma'am?" I turned to see Mr. Johnson, my neighbor. He was a retired police officer, and his eyes were fixed on Kevin, his expression hard. He'd been watching from his yard, and thank God he had. "I think it's time for the clown to leave," Mr. Johnson said, stepping closer. His presence seemed to unnerve Kevin, who took a step back, his eyes darting between us. "I'm just doing my job," Kevin muttered, but there was a nervous edge to his voice now. Mr. Johnson didn't back down. He moved closer, his hand resting on his hip, and that's when I saw it, a glint of metal at Kevin's waist. "You need to leave. Now," Mr. Johnson said, his voice low and commanding. Kevin hesitated, then turned, trying to make a run for it. But Mr. Johnson was faster. He grabbed Kevin, pinning him against the fence, and I saw the weapon fall from Kevin's pocket, a small handgun, hidden beneath his clown costume. The next few minutes were a blur. Someone called the police, and they arrived quickly, their sirens wailing as they pulled up in front of the house. They took Kevin away, his painted face now pale, his eyes empty. The officer told me later that Kevin was a wanted fugitive, using clown gigs as a cover to scout vulnerable homes. My stomach turned at the thought of how close we'd come to something far worse. That night, after everyone had left and the yard was quiet, I sat on the porch, watching Tommy play with his new toys, blissfully unaware of what had almost happened. My hands were still shaking, and I knew I'd never look at a clown the same way again. I'd wanted to give my son the perfect birthday, but instead, I'd brought danger right to our doorstep. The neighborhood rallied after that. We all agreed to be more careful, to vet anyone who came into our community, especially when it involved our children. We put together a list of trusted entertainers, made sure background checks were done. It was a hard lesson, but one we all took to heart. I looked at Tommy, his laughter filling the air as he chased the dog across the yard. I couldn't protect him from everything, but I'd do my best, and I'd never ignore my instincts again. Not when it came to my son. Story 5. It was August 2020, and I was driving along Route 66, the vast stretches of New Mexico desert spreading endlessly on either side of me. The radio crackled with static, and the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, settling in for the long haul. Driving these roads, you saw some strange sights now and then, but I was used to it. Flickers of movement in the dark, weird roadkill, even the occasional bizarre hitchhiker. Nothing much fazed me after all these years. "You seen this, Daryl?" crackled Bill's voice through the CB radio. Bill was my colleague, driving his rig a few miles behind me. He sounded wary, and I frowned, picking up my mic. "What's that, Bill?" I asked, glancing in my rearview mirror. "Up ahead," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "There's some clown standing by the road, thumb out like she's trying to hitch a ride." I squinted, and sure enough, I spotted her up ahead. She was dressed head to toe in a circus clown outfit, oversized shoes, striped pants, and a bright red nose. Her face was painted white, with smudges of blue and red around her eyes and mouth. She looked completely out of place, standing there in the middle of nowhere, her thumb held high. "You gonna pick her up?" Bill asked, the skepticism in his voice clear. I hesitated, my eyes locked on the clown as I slowed down. Something about her drew me in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strangeness of the whole situation. "I think I will," I said, ignoring Bill's groan of disapproval. I pulled over, and the clown jogged up to the truck, her oversized shoes flapping against the asphalt. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy, and I could see she was young, maybe mid-20s. "Need a ride?" I asked, leaning out the window. She nodded, a jittery smile spreading across her painted face. "Thanks, mister," she said, her voice soft, almost childlike. "I need to get away. The circus. They're after me." That caught my attention, but I didn't press. I pushed open the door and she climbed in, settling into the passenger seat. She smelled like sweat and something metallic, and her hands fidgeted constantly in her lap. "Name's Clara," she said, her eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. "Daryl," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road as I pulled back onto the highway. Behind me, Bill's headlights were a steady presence, a reminder that I wasn't alone out here. Clara didn't make much sense as we drove. She muttered to herself, talking about the circus, about people who were after her, about needing to hide. Her mood swung wildly. One minute she was laughing, the next she was crying, her face buried in her oversized sleeves. I tried to keep my focus on the road, but her erratic behavior had me on edge. "You all right back there, Daryl?" Bill's voice crackled again. I glanced at Clara. She was staring out the window, her expression vacant. "Yeah, Bill. Just keep an eye out," I said, my voice low. Something wasn't right. Clara kept shifting in her seat, her hand disappearing into the folds of her clown costume. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Then, without warning, she lunged at the wheel. "Turn around!" she screamed, her hands grabbing at the steering wheel, yanking it to the side. The truck swerved, tires screeching against the asphalt, and I fought to keep control. "Bill, I need help!" I shouted into the CB, my heart pounding as I struggled against Clara. The rig swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road, gravel spraying up as I pulled it back onto the highway. Bill's headlights flashed as he sped up, pulling alongside us, his horn blaring. Clara was thrashing in her seat, her face twisted in panic. I managed to wrestle the wheel back, bringing the truck to a shuddering stop on the shoulder. Bill pulled over in front of us, jumping out of his cab and running back towards me. "Get her out of here," I yelled as Bill yanked open the passenger door. Clara fought him, her hands flailing, but he managed to pull her out, pinning her arms behind her back. That's when I saw it. Something metallic glinting from under her costume. A bag, half open, filled with bundles of cash. "What the hell?" Bill muttered, his eyes wide as he caught sight of the money. Clara was sobbing now, her makeup smeared, her eyes wild. "They'll kill me," she whispered, her voice breaking. I had to get away. I had to take it. The police arrived not long after, their lights flashing red and blue across the desert landscape. They took Clara away, her cries echoing in the still night air. One of the officers pulled Bill and me aside, explaining that there had been a robbery, a small traveling circus hit by one of their own. Clara had been on the run, carrying the stolen money with her, afraid of what her accomplices would do if they found her. Bill and I watched as they drove her away, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving only exhaustion. "You're an idiot for picking her up, you know that?" Bill said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Yeah," I said, letting out a long breath. "I know." We got back in our trucks, the silence between us heavy. As we pulled back onto the road, I couldn't help but glance at the empty seat beside me, the ghost of Clara's presence lingering. It was a hard lesson, but one I wouldn't forget. Out here on the road, you had to be careful. You never knew who you might run into, or what kind of danger they might bring with them. And the story of the circus clown hitchhiker became one more cautionary tale, passed between truckers over late-night coffee stops and crackling CB radios, a reminder that even out here, in the vast emptiness of the desert, you could never be too careful.